All right, I'm gonna get us started. So this is Hindutva in America, a threat to equality and religious pluralism, hosted by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights and the American Constitution Society, Rutgers Law Chapter. Our speakers today are going to be Safa Ahmed, the Media Director at the Indian American Muslim Council, and Vivek Kambayan, an organizer for Hindus for Human Rights. So just a quick disclaimer. This event is intended to educate attendees who voluntarily register and listen about the rise of anti-Muslim racism in India and America against South Asian Muslims. Part of open intellectual inquiry at academic institutions is to confront matters of public interest that impact real people's lives. Hindutva in America is one of those matters impacting U.S. foreign policy, transnational repression, and civil rights. Nothing in this presentation is intended to harm any individual or group of people. None of the views expressed in this event represent the views of Rutgers University or Rutgers Law School. So just an overview, this event will be about an hour. Our speakers will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A at the end for our audience. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liam. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be in this session with you. Very excited to do this whole walkthrough on Hindutva in America with you. As mentioned, I am the Associate Media Director, of the Indian American Muslim Council, which is an over 2-decade-year-old organization that advocates for the rights of Muslims in India, but also advocates against the rise of Hindu supremacy globally. And I've been told that perhaps not everyone in this call has much of a background on Hindu supremacy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you all a from the ground up walkthrough of what Hindutva is, what its origins are, who are its main thought leaders, and also who are the forces that are spreading it globally. I will, of course, talk about its influence and impact in the United States, especially on minorities. And then I'll pass it off to Vivek, my co-panelist, to talk more about the work being done on the ground to combat it. So starting from the top, Hindutva, its ideology and impact. What is Hindutva, or Hindu supremacy, as we in the advocacy space like to call it? I think that the best way to describe Hindutva is in the words of those who are the most affected by it, which would be minorities in India and specifically Indian Muslims. So here on the screen, you'll see a quote from an activist named Afrin Fatima, who rose to prominence in around 2019-2020 when the Indian government passed a discriminatory law targeting Muslims' citizenship rights. And she said here, "We are trying to survive. We are trying to be brave. We are trying not to let hopelessness overcome us. This monstrous state has filled everyone with hate. Our humanity is being robbed." Similarly, here's another quote from student activist Umar Khalid, who says, "What is my fault?" And again, he's addressing the situation in India at the time with regards to this discriminatory citizenship law. What is my fault? Is my fault that I say that this country is as much mine as it is yours? For their advocacy, Afrin Fatima's home was destroyed in 2022 by a bulldozer deployed by the Indian government, and Umar Khalid remains in prison. He has been imprisoned since 2021-ish, and he is repeatedly being denied bail. So he remains a prisoner of conscience till this day. So what is Hindutva, or Hindu nationalism? How do you define this force that is taking lives, taking away the freedom of so many in India today? Hindutva, or Hindu nationalism, to put it in very basic terms, is a right-wing political ideology, and that is very important. It is a purely political ideology that was modeled off of World War II era European fascism, including Nazism. It does not claim, as some refer to it, it does not refer to Hinduness, or this idea of Hindu identity. It is separate from Hinduism as a religion, and that's something that Vivek will get into a little bit more towards the end from a Hindu perspective. But to break down Hindutva's core views, I think usually if you were to boil everything down to the most basic facts, Hindu supremacists have 3 key beliefs. The first one being that Hindus, especially upper caste Hindus, that is also very important, are by default superior over non-Hindus. Second point is that minorities should be stripped of their human rights, reduced to second-class citizens, and subjected to mass violence. And the last point is that India should not be a secular democracy as is mandated by the Indian Constitution, but it should instead be a Hindu theocratic ethno-state. to talk about the brief history of where this ideology comes from. Hindu supremacist ideology was first articulated by a man named V.D. Savarkar, and he was writing this book called The Essentials of Hindutva in 1923. In it, he is very clear about what the motivations of Hindu supremacist ideology are. Savarkar was writing at a time when British colonialism was still raging in full force in India. He was writing at a time when leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Abul Kalam Azad, all these freedom fighters were at the forefront of calling for India's freedom as this secular state that afforded equal rights to all. But Savarkar had a different approach. And in Essentials of Hindutva, he was thinking, okay, how do I unite Hindus only? What is nationalism from a Hindu perspective? And in this book, he declares nothing makes the self conscious of itself so much as a conflict with non-self. Nothing can weld people into a nation and nations into a state as the pressure of a common foe. And here he was referring to the introduction of foreign faiths, aka Islam and Christianity, to India. And based on his ideology, the Hindu militant group, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, was founded 2 years later in 1925. Savarkar was very unapologetic about where he took inspiration for this ideology from. In a speech, he said, I want to say he gave this a few years after writing Essentials of Hindutva, but he said in this speech, who are we to dictate to Germany, Japan, or Russia, or Italy to choose a particular form of government? Hitler knows better what suits Germany best. And he also refers to Nazism and fascism as this magical wand that cured the health, quote unquote, of these countries. So it's a very explicit admiration for Nazism. And again, when he talks about these isms here, as you see in the quote, that are being cured from these nations, he's talking about the existence of minorities. M.S. Golwalkar, who was the second chief of the RSS, actually articulated this with even more directness. And he says here that the foreign races in India must either adopt Hindu culture and language, must learn to respect and hold in reverence Hindu religion, must entertain no ideas but those of glorification of the Hindu race and culture. Minorities must be wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, not even citizens' rights. And that's really, really on the nose. So there's really no room for discussion about it. There are some people, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, who like to say that Hindu nationalism is about Hindu identity, protecting Hindu culture, and celebration of Hindu faith. And those things in isolation are wonderful things and should be done. But Hindutva specifically, it cannot be denied that this is an ideology based on the violent exclusion of minorities. Just to give you a bit more background on the RSS will be important as I'm talking about Hindutva in America, so bear with me. This is the mothership of the Hindutva movement globally, and it spawned several militant groups, charities, education foundations, and even a political party in its existence. It's now been 100 years since the RSS was founded. And this political party that it spawned is India's current ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, also known as the BJP. The RSS has actually been banned multiple times in India for its involvement in acts of violence to further its ideology. And in fact, the first time the RSS was banned was after a former member named Nathuram Godse assassinated Mahatma Gandhi in 1948, following which Hindutva's founding ideologue, V.D. Savarkar, who I just mentioned, was also named as an accused in the conspiracy to assassinate Gandhi. So if you're thinking, okay, what relevance does Hindutva have in India's early history? Look no further than the assassination of India's most iconic freedom fighter. Here's a picture of the RSS, just so you have an idea of who I'm talking about. Again, bear in mind that these were really modeled, the RSS's training camps were really modeled off of the Nazi youth training camps during World War II era Germany. Now, Nathuram Godse, I do need to point out, he had a lot of conviction in the fact that his assassination of Gandhi was a good thing. And he does say in his final statement to the jury before he is sentenced for this act, that he has no doubt that honest writers of history will weigh his act and find the true value thereof someday in the future. And he was talking, about his hatred for Gandhi's appeasement, quote unquote, of India's Muslim minority. I'm going to pause here really quickly because I do think it is important to say once again that Hindutva is not Hinduism before I go into the more modern harms of Hindu supremacy. Vivek, again, will talk more about this in a bit, but Hinduism is an ancient and extremely diversely practiced religion, and Hindutva is, once again, a right-wing political ideology. And this is something that Savarkar himself made clear in Essentials of Hindutva. He says Hinduism is only a derivative of Hindutva. Failure to distinguish between these two terms has given rise to much misunderstanding. And Sadhana, a progressive Hindu advocacy group, also says, I think very aptly, this is a majoritarian vision, no different from the ugliness of white nationalism or conservative politicians who argue that the United States is a Christian country. So that analogy, I think, should put things into perspective for all of you. Now I'm going to move on to who it is that spreads Hindutva. I'm going to start with India first and foremost. So you see here, the bottom corner of the screen, a picture of the RSS. And the picture of the man right on top of that is none other than Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who actually got his start in the Hindu supremacist movement at a very young age. He joined the RSS at the age of 8 years old. And knowing what you know about the thought process of the RSS's leaders and its vision and everything, you can be well assured that this ideology has colored every aspect of Modi's political life. In 2002, Modi actually was serving as the chief minister, kind of like adjacent to an American governor, of the North Indian state of Gujarat. And under his rule, Hindu supremacist groups actually carried out a pogrom against Muslims in the state, to the point where 2,000 men, women, and children were brutally slaughtered, and there was widespread rape and sexual mutilation of Muslim women and girls. So this horrific chapter in India's history, which is known as the 2002 Gujarat pogrom, has really been a stain on Modi since that time. But it didn't do a lot to temper his popularity. Modi actually would ride that rise in fame and notoriety that he gained from the Gujarat pogrom all the way up to the office of Prime Minister in 2014. And Modi and his base, actually, let me talk about Modi's base first. A lot of Modi's base was, bolstered by the fact that these Hindu supremacists who were once on the margins were now looking at this man and saying, okay, here's a leader who will let our ideology have free reign in this country. And so Modi and the BJP have really created this climate where there is complete impunity for mob violence, mob lynchings, attacks on Muslim homes, businesses, attacks on mosques, legal threats against Muslims in several different capacities, interfaith relationships, so much, like even interfaith friendships, interfaith interactions have all become criminalized in in the country of India as of right now because of this pervasive climate of hatred that Modi and the BJP have created. And just to give you an idea of how vast the amount of persecution against Muslims is in India today, here are just a couple of headlines that have been collected over the past couple of years. In August 2019, NPR reported on India's minorities being targeted in mob lynchings. Till this day, mob lynchings remain a rampant problem in India. Muslims are currently being illegally deported into Bangladesh. Hindu extremists repeatedly call for genocide of Muslims, including elected officials at the highest level of government. In Assam, which is a state in northeast India, Muslims are being stripped of basic dignities, citizenship rights, and again, being pushed over the border into Bangladesh, often in violent ways, separating families, separating children from their parents. And you also have these widespread legal attacks on historic mosques across India, attacks on Muslim-owned homes and businesses, and the deploying of bulldozers against them as a form of collective punishment. All of this has been going on in India since, okay, so there have been several escalations over time, but since 2019, the situation has really gone from bad to worse and worse and worse over the years. So with all of that context in mind, and I haven't even touched on other minorities, Sikhs in India are being targeted, Christians in India are being targeted, Dalits in India, also known formerly as untouchables or quote unquote lower caste Hindus are constantly being targeted in India. But I just want to give you that, that background first, that every single minority group in India is being threatened in some way, shape, or form. It's just the Muslim minority is unfortunately bearing a lot of the brunt of that at this moment. So now turning to the US. Some of you, if you've read the report, you might recognize this image from the cover of it. I'll talk about Hindutva and how it's impacting people in the United States now. So, Hindutva diaspora networks. I talked to you about the RSS and how it is the mothership of the global Hindu supremacist movement. The RSS, as I mentioned, has spawned multiple groups across the globe. These are like flagship groups. Sometimes they're directly affiliated. Sometimes they're just ideologically related to the RSS. But essentially, you have this widespread network of diaspora groups that share support for Modi and Hindutva, and these diaspora groups are basically conducting outreach efforts and messaging efforts to get people to sympathize more with Modi, the BJP, and the RSS's ideological project. Some of these groups are mentioned in CSRR's report. These include the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the American wing of the RSS. It also includes the Vish Hindu Parishad of America, which is the American wing of a militant group called the Vish Hindu Parishad, which operates in India, also has a very bloody history. Sewa International, which is a charity, Ekal Vidyala, and several other groups have overt ties to violent extremist groups in India. Again, a lot of these groups somehow or other do eventually tie back to the RSS. Not all of them, I will say, but many of them do. So often these groups will pose in the United States as benign cultural, educational, or even human rights organizations. Obviously, they're not going to follow the same model as they do in India. And India, Hindutva is very violent. It is very in your face. There is very little reason for them to couch it in any sort of flowery language, or to appeal to anyone other than their own extremist followers. But in the United States, it's actually very common to see Hindu supremacist talking points repackaged as this sort of anti-racist, decolonial, and almost like social justice-y packaging to mask the supremacist elements of it. And I'll get into a little bit of how that works in just a second. Here is a map. This comes from the website Stop Hindutva in America. Very helpful if you're interested in learning more about the different Hindu supremacist networks, both in India and in the United States, but I'm not going to dwell too much on this. I know that's a lot of acronyms for you all. But what you need to know about their tactics is that, they're very similar to those of the American far right. You are all probably very familiar with the ways in which the American far right has slowly shifted from, being very overtly white, Christian, nationalist to now showing a variety of, a lot of brown faces joining the crowd. And so some of the ways in which the American Hindu supremacist groups here in this country are trying to distinguish themselves from other minorities is by playing this game of wedge politics first and foremost. I have here a quote from the Hindu Policy Research and Advocacy Collective. This quote is actually from an infographic that they put out, and Al Jazeera had mentioned it in an article, where they say, Indians skip the ghetto stage, quote unquote, common to most immigrant stories. There's another quote here from Asim Shukla, who is the co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation, and here he's speaking about Islam. He says, there are violent voices aspiring for a global wave that establishes a world ruled under the Islamic crescent. These are very clearly hateful comments put out by the Hindu far right in the United States. And when I say wedge politics, I think most of you might have a slight understanding of it, but just to really lay it out, wedge politics essentially is when a certain group is trying to distinguish themselves from the others who might be perceived as similar to them. So in this case, you see Hindu supremacists very, very commonly trying to carve out this distinction between them and other quote unquote bad minorities. You'll very clearly often see them trying to associate with, immigrants who have been assimilated into whiteness, Italian folks, Irish folks, and then at the same time throwing other minorities who come from their very country of origin under the bus. You will see them repeatedly smearing Muslim Americans. You'll see them smearing Sikhs. You'll see them smearing Dalits and progressive Hindus, and really trying to appeal to this model minority myth. We are the good brown brown people. And these are the ones that you should hate. We are the good immigrants. We built ourselves up we built ourselves up. We pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, all that American dream jargon, and making this claim that we are the immigrants that contribute to this country, unlike those quote unquote who are still in their ghetto stage. It's very overtly racist and very overtly plays into anti-minority tropes. You'll also see at the same time, however, that these folks don't like to be on the receiving end of racism themselves, so they do like to weaponize social justice language. Anytime there is criticism of Hindu supremacy, Hindutva, Modi, the BJP put out into the world, whether it's through an academic institution or by an activist or even by a journalist, you will see these Hindu supremacists coming out to say that, hey, that's actually not criticism of Hindutva, it's criticism of Hinduism. And then you'll see this talking point often trotted out, this bad faith bias claim saying that you are actually being Hindu-phobic by criticizing India or the Indian government or the supremacist ideology. You'll often see Hindu supremacist policies and some atrocities framed as decolonization or as quote unquote protecting Indian Hindus. One thing that I do want to mention as an example is India's slow move to criminalize interfaith marriages. Right now, I can't remember how many states in India have passed this law, but several have passed a law that essentially makes it extremely difficult for a Hindu woman to marry anyone outside her faith, but especially a Muslim man. And so these laws, which are very clearly infringing on the right of private citizens to live their life however they want and are very clearly sexist, are being framed as like, oh, these are just protecting Hindus from predatory attempts to convert them. You'll also see these claims of decolonization trotted out against literal atrocities, such as the demolition in 1992 of a historic mosque known as the Babri Masjid. That was torn down by Hindu militant groups, as I said, decades ago. But recently, Prime Minister Narendra Modi built a temple on top of the space where the mosque had been. That was really framed by Hindu supremacists in the United States as this moment of celebration, this moment of reclaiming this space for themselves. And so there's a lot I could go into, but I'll move it along so that we can get to Vivek's portion as well. Spreading BJP propaganda for an American audience. Here you see a picture of a bulldozer being paraded down the street in a town in New Jersey. The bulldozer, as I mentioned, is often used in India to destroy Muslim-owned homes and businesses, to destroy livelihoods. And here you see it being included in an Indian Independence Day parade in 2022, decorated with pictures of Modi and one of his biggest supporters, a Hindu militant monk named Yogi Adityanath. So you'll see a lot of this, overt flexing of Hindu supremacist iconography or hate symbols. Anti-minority hate is something that these groups engage in a lot. The CSRR report goes into incredible depth on this and how these groups are really involved in the global push to spread anti-Muslim bigotry. But you'll see that Hindu American far-right groups have actually collaborated with prominent anti-Muslim actors such as Robert Spencer, the Middle East Forum, Amy Meck. All of these people who really made their name off of the post-9/11 hate wave against Muslims are now turning to Hindu supremacist audiences to maintain some sort of relevancy. You'll see them opposing civil rights protections in the United States, where you would think that, as a minority group, you would want civil rights protections to be laid out for all. Instead, usually when they're targeting Dalit Americans or Sikh Americans, Hindu supremacists have opposed protections for these vulnerable groups against things like caste discrimination and transnational repression. I could go into these details, but I want to keep to time. You'll often see them harassing their critics. So you'll see them deploying slap lawsuits against academics, journalists, activists, even government agencies. The California, I think it was the California Civil Rights Department that was actually sued by the Hindu American Foundation for starting this fight against caste-based discrimination. You'll also see them leveling targeted social media harassment campaigns against people who are outspoken against the ideology, and this will include often horrific threats of death, sexual assault, threats against family members, you name it. They've probably threatened, some of these major activists with it, which is quite unfortunate. And last but not least, I do want to end with talking about how these individuals are not a fringe group, even in the global sense, because you are seeing Hindu supremacists more and more allying with white supremacists in a way that people should not be ignoring. So in 2024, RSS leader Ram Madhav was invited to speak at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. And here he addressed a group of far-right leaders from the United States, the UK, Israel, France, and he tells them, I'm going to paraphrase, but he said, I'm here to tell you about our success in India in defeating the leftist, Marxist, Islamist cabal, which is quite a phrase to put together. I don't think those words have ever been spoken by anyone in anyone's bloodline. But you see here that there is this push to be aligned with the global far right. And that's something that we need to pay attention to for those of us who are concerned about rising fascism globally. Of course, I would be remiss to mention, sorry, it is important for me to point out that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is also friends with Trump. I'm sure, as you all know, with the tariff situation, that relationship has been on the rocks a little bit, but Modi has shared the stage with Trump in the past, particularly in 2019. A crowd of 50,000 attendees welcomed Modi to Texas at an event called Howdy Modi, in which Donald Trump was the special guest. And the Republican Hindu Coalition appointed Steve Bannon as its co-chair in 2019. So these connections are all there. They're all very much out in the open, and it is very important for us as people who are concerned about rising fascism to take note of that. I do want to end on this very interesting article. When we talk about the RSS, we talk about Hindutva, we talk about the global far right and its alliances. There's an article that just came out in Prism that talks about how India's largest far right Hindu organization, the RSS, actually hired U.S. lobbyists for a congressional influence campaign. And that is a big problem. That is something that all of us need to be concerned about. The RSS having influence, lobbying influence here in the United States is concerning. And so I do want to leave you with this idea that Hindu supremacy is not just an India issue, is not a foreign policy issue. It is an issue that impacts not just Indian American Muslims or Indian American Hindus or anyone in the Indian American diaspora. It is a threat to all Americans who are concerned about the state of our democracy, who are concerned about keeping our rights, who are concerned about the global far right gaining more and more influence by the day. And so I want to leave you with this. I do ask you all to check out this article. It's very informative, very interesting. And I'll also leave you with a couple of resources. Of course, do check out CSRR's report on Hindutva in America. If you haven't, if you or anyone you know has ever faced harassment from Hindu supremacists in the past, or you would like to be prepared to be able to identify it in the event that it does show up in your life, you can check out the Hindutva Harassment Field Manual created by the South Asia Scholar Activist Collective. And lastly, Vivek will talk a little bit more about our coalition called We Are Severa. But Severa has put out multiple reports on Hindutva in America that really does a deep dive into each of the individual groups that are posing large threats to pluralism and democracy here in the United States. So I'll leave you with that, and then I will now turn it over to Vivek to continue on the conversation.
Thanks so much, Safa, for that comprehensive presentation on Hindutva. That was amazing. My name is Vivek Kimbayan. I'm an organizer at Hindus for Human Rights. And at Hindus for Human Rights, we're working to build and strengthen a progressive Hindu community in the diaspora. And a crucial part of that work is providing a Hindu voice of resistance to Hindutva and caste. And Safa talked a bit, I think very well, about the difference between Hindutva as a political ideology, as a far-right extremist, ethno-nationalist political ideology, and Hinduism, which is a religion that is incredibly diverse and does not have anywhere in its texts or tenets or even in its main proponents and religious figures this ideology. And I really applaud Safa for the way that she drew that out. As a Hindu, I have to say I am really offended by the efforts of Hindutva supporters to claim to represent all Hindus, especially when their exclusionary agenda of subordinating people of other faiths is directly contradicted by one of the central tenets of Hinduism, which is pluralism. The way it's been explained to me as a child is that to think of all different faiths as like different rivers leading to the same ocean. And that I can't think of anything that is more at odds with the Hindutva vision of Hindu supremacy. And I think it's important as well to place this in kind of the broader context of history and culture in South Asia, where it's home to people of many different faiths, living and worshiping alongside each other, often in a syncretic way, where they may, you may have you do have Hindus who will be celebrating Eid with their Muslim neighbors. You have Muslims who are celebrating Diwali with their Hindu neighbors, and there's really countless examples of that. And so this political project, this extremist political project, is in many ways intentionally trying to recast the truth of Indian and South Asian history, as well as the lived reality of South Asian history for many people. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Um, as well. And Safa briefly mentioned the Severa Coalition, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Severa Coalition and how when we organize together against Hindutva, we win. The Severa Coalition seeks to unite different communities in the South Asian diaspora against supremacy of all kinds, including Hindutva. And in addition to the Indian American Muslim Council, which Safa is a part of, and Hindus for Human Rights, which I'm a part of, the coalition also includes the Ambedkar King Study Circle, Dalit Solidarity Forum, India Civil Watch International, SALDEF, which is the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Sikh Coalition. And our collaboration as a coalition takes many forms. Safa mentioned a couple of the educational reports that Severa has put out to raise awareness of right-wing Hindutva groups like the VHPA and the Hindu American Foundation. We've also mobilized our communities together on common legislative efforts, like SB 403, which was a bill that would have banned caste discrimination in California's employment law, and as well as SB 509 this year, another bill in California that would have addressed transnational repression, which is when foreign governments seek to target people in the United States, oftentimes activists or people of minority faiths. And they do that through assassinations and attempted assassinations, as well as threats, intimidation, and other tactics. And both of these bills, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, so I saw this up close. Both of these bills were incredibly popular and are incredibly popular in California as well as within the legislature, and that's why both bills actually passed both the state assembly and the state senate. But when they were presented to California Governor Gavin Newsom, he vetoed both of these measures, and that was the result of intense lobbying by Hindutva supporting donors. One of the most prominent was not even in California. It was a donor in Massachusetts who was bragging about how he had convinced Gavin Newsom to veto the caste discrimination bill. And we've seen how Hindu groups on both of these bills were really spreading, they're really fear mongering and trying to spread fear within the Hindu community about what these bills would do and lying and spreading outright misinformation. But I think it's important, we're talking about Hindutva as a right-wing ideology, which it is. I think it's also really important to bring out that a lot of liberals, Democrats, people like Gavin Newsom, who you might not think of as being, right wing, are also very susceptible to this. And, it's important for that to be an understanding of the far right. What does it mean for someone like Gavin Newsom to tweet against Trump while he's doing the bidding of Hindu extremists who share Trump's politics, his tactics, his vision, and that support him outright in his political campaigns? So that's just one example, I think, of the way that Hindutva manifests in a way in the United States. In California, that is harmful to all of our communities. When our employment non-discrimination laws in California don't include caste, that makes California a less equal place for everyone, not just people who are Dalits. When our governor vetoes a bill that would better equip our communities against transnational repression, that makes all of us less safe. But I do want to make sure we understand that if we stand in solidarity together and we fight back, we can win against these Hindu extremists. I think one of the popular tactics of the Hindu far right in the United States, especially, is that they exploit a lot of misunderstanding of the Hindu community and are very, they're organized, they're well funded, and they present themselves as representing all Hindus. And they try to make themselves out to be bigger and more influential and more representative than they are. They actually, their ideology is a marginal one within our community, both the Hindu community as well as the broader South Asian community. So I'm going to talk about one example from earlier this year. Which took place in a Bay Area community called Fremont, California, that has a very large South Asian population as well as a very large Hindu population. The California State Legislature recently passed a bill that makes ethnic studies a requirement for graduating high schoolers in California at public schools. And ethnic studies, there's a lot I could say about ethnic studies, but if you're not familiar, generally, it is a course that emphasizes education about different communities in the United States, here in this case in California, including different ethnicities, different faiths, different cultures, and really centers that so that students who graduate from high school have an understanding not only of other communities, but also of their place and the way that they fit together with our society here. I remember, growing up that I didn't learn about any of this stuff until college, and I wish that I had. So there's this requirement, and many school districts in California, before this requirement was in place, offered ethnic studies classes as an elective. It was not required, but oftentimes was very popular. And Fremont is a school district that did a school system that did offer that. And so there was a school board meeting in which the Fremont School Board was presented with basically the option to renew their existing ethnic studies curriculum, which generally would be considered pretty non-contentious. But at that school board meeting, there was a large group of Hindutva supporters who showed up and agitated against this. And so the school board decided to table the measure until the following school board meeting 2 weeks later. And Hindus for Human Rights and the Indian American Muslim Council were contacted by concerned community members who alerted us to what was going on. And we mobilized along with other Severa Coalition members, specifically the Ambedkar King Study Circle, to give public comment at the next school board meeting, where we mobilized our folks, Hindus, Muslims, Dalits, people from all different backgrounds, to talk about why ethnic studies is important and why we support it, and to really try to counter this narrative that our communities were against it. And at that school board meeting, there were 19 people that gave public comment, and 16 of them were in favor of ethnic studies. Two of the comments were from staff members of Hindutva organizations, specifically the Hindu American Foundation and Hindu Pact, who lied about what was in the curriculum. They misrepresented what was in the curriculum, and these lies were rebutted in the meeting itself, by a school board member and another by a community member. And at the end of this school board meeting, the school board voted unanimously to continue the ethnic studies curriculum that they had in place. So I just, use that as one example. In some ways, it's a very small example in one community in a school board, where mobilizing just a dozen people to show up, speak out against Hindutva, and try to counter the Hindutva narrative was extremely successful. And I think it's really important for us as we're thinking about Hindutva and its role, to not give it more power than it has, and to realize that our own power in fighting against it, especially when we mobilize our communities and we work together in solidarity as the Severa Coalition does. So with that, I want to be, mindful of time, and Liam, I'll turn it over to you, I think, for some questions and answers. Thanks.
Thank you so much both for that. That was incredibly informative. Just a reminder, we're going to do a Q&A session at the end. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A and post it in the chat, and we'll try to get to it. Real quick, we're going to go through some moderator questions. So first, this is open to both of you. Hindutva ideology and organizations in India have transnational links through diaspora networks. From your perspective, what are the most concerning ways this ideology manifests or gains influence within US-based institutions, whether that be cultural, political, or educational?
I can go first and then pass it to Vivek. So I can speak from the perspective of the Muslim community, which is, in the United States, a minority within a minority in the Indian diaspora. And so for the past few decades, I mean, Hindutva has been in the United States since around the 1970s. But in recent years, we've seen this political ideology gaining more foothold in American politics as well as in cultural spaces, as I mentioned. Part of the alarming ways in which that manifests is, as I spoke about, the parading of hate symbols or, the spreading of hate speech. That's all, stuff that is really harmful, but also stuff that, as Muslim Americans in a post 9/11 world, we're, a bit more used to. However, I will say that there are some concerning efforts as well to push Muslims out of civic spaces that I do think need to be called out. And I'll give one example of that. In 2022, in Illinois, there was a law passed that was instating an Indian American Advisory Council to the governor. But the language of this law was very much so exclusionary because it defined an Indian as a person. I'm going to paraphrase a little, but as a person who was from any country in the subcontinent that is not of a primarily Muslim character. If you think about the implications of that, that is very starkly on its face, first of all, blatantly exclusive to Muslims, it's blatantly excluding them. But it's also making this claim that these other countries in South Asia, like Nepal, like Bhutan, are part of the Indian Hindu supremacist expansionist vision for the subcontinent. That's something I didn't touch on in my presentation, but it is quite alarming that that language, because of ignorance, generally speaking, among the American public and among politicians, made it all the way to the point of being put into law. Now that law was then, amended, and now there's a South Asian American Advisory Council in Illinois. But still, that's one of the ways in which you see this like push to exclude Indian Muslims from spaces that should be welcome to them.
Thanks, Safa. I want to just, we've talked a lot about Hindus and Muslims in this conversation, and Safa has mentioned other communities, and I just want to uplift a little bit the Sikh community, which is a huge part of, the South Asian community here in the United States and the diaspora, as well as, of course, in India and in South Asia. And one of the more concerning ways that I've seen Hindutva show up is through this transnational repression tactic, where supporters of Hindutva will specifically target Sikh communities here in the United States. One way we saw this in the Bay Area was a right-wing Hindu supremacist group, the Hindu American Foundation, worked with a local district attorney, Jeff Rosen, the district attorney of Santa Clara County in the South Bay, to organize a training for law enforcement that was really about spreading disinformation and misinformation about the Sikh community. And when a member of the Hindu American Foundation was questioned about this by a journalist, I believe the Sacramento Bee, she said that Sikh gurudwaras, which are houses of worship, were places for crime and drugs, which is just a blatantly, one, false accusation, but also just a blatantly racist and discriminatory statement. And to say that, to spread these lies about the community, especially with law enforcement during a time like this, is so dangerous and really despicable. And that's one tactic that we see. And I think one of the things that really concerns me is that a group like the Hindu American Foundation tries to say that it's advocating for the civil rights of Hindus, but really what it's more often doing is spreading fear, disinformation, and targeting groups like Sikh Americans and Muslim Americans, and working with law enforcement to try to do that, which is really, really concerning, and I think something that we need to be pushing back against. Another tactic, I think Safa mentioned this briefly, but I do want to talk a little bit more about it, is this idea of Hinduphobia, which is a term that Hindutva supporters will often deploy when they are criticized, to say that any criticism of Hindutva, again, a political ideology that's not about a religion, is somehow Hinduphobic or discriminatory against Hindus. And there was an excellent piece recently, and I don't know, Liam, if you're able to post it in the chat, from a reporter at Jewish Currents who audited the HAF, the Hindu American Foundation's claims of Hinduphobia, using their own definition to show that I think it was over 70% of the so-called documented instances of Hinduphobia that they were claiming did not meet their own definition of Hinduphobia. And this could take the form of saying that something where someone was targeted for their race, for example, was and not their faith or religion, and maybe may not have even been Hindu, is somehow Hinduphobic. So I just want to raise a little bit of awareness of that tactic and how it shows up in our communities.
Thank you. That was great. I just posted that. I think it was the right article in the chat, the link to it, with the audit. So I'm just going to do one more question, moderator question, and then we'll get to the audience Q&A. What could allies, including students, faith groups, and civil rights advocates, do to support your work against Hindutva spread while maintaining respect for South Asian diversity and avoiding essentializing narratives?
I'll maybe start on this one. I think educating yourself on Hindutva and people that you're in community with on Hindutva is really important. I mentioned all the different constituent organizations of Savera. If you're looking for resources, or you can reach out to any of our organizations and we'd be happy to speak about Hindutva in your community. If you belong to a community that fits into one of our organizations, join us in this work and in this fight. But I think at this stage, I think we need a lot more awareness about Hindutva, and I really applaud Rutgers and the Center for Security, Race, and Rights for surfacing this, and really highlighting it, because it's really important to for us to better understand what Hindutva is and the many ways that it's showing up.
I think that's a great answer. Covers pretty much everything that I would have said myself. But yeah, I think the main reason why Hindutva has found any purchase at all in these like liberal democratic spaces in the United States is because people are usually well-intentioned. They don't want to seem like they're throwing any community under the bus or ignoring someone who is saying like, hey, this is what my community stands for. And it is easy for well-meaning individuals who don't have a lot of knowledge to fall prey to that sort of rhetoric and then end up accidentally propping up some sort of harmful nationalist rhetoric. And I think for those situations, it is so important for us as individuals, as Vivek said, to just be more aware, to read through reports like this Rutgers report, to check out some of the resources I mentioned. Hindutva is actually quite easy to identify. Once you understand their talking points, you will see so many parallels to the way white Christian nationalists speak. This way of speaking in terms that are exclusionary, self-victimizing at the expense of other minorities, this attempt to erase the experiences of others. And meanwhile, you have coalitions who are very clearly standing up for the exact opposite, which is what Savera is doing. We're very clear that our movement is an inclusive one. We envision this future for the Indian American diaspora, which, the majority does support. This more inclusive vision for our future, as referenced in the Indian American Attitude Survey from 2024, from Carnegie, I believe. And so from that survey, you'll see that most Indian Americans are against these supremacist ideologies. And so with that knowledge in mind, it is so important to talk to people who know what these movements look like, become informed yourself, and then that makes it so much more easy to know who do I align with in this in when these discussions come up, and what do I stand for? What do people who support a pluralistic future for the Indian American diaspora stand for?
Thank you both so much. All right, we're gonna go right into audience questions. So first, those are on Mamdani's campaign seem to really have unified and energized the South Asian community. Has there been any anti-Mamdani movements from Hindu nationalists? If there hasn't been much talk about it, do you anticipate such speech to come given Mamdani's progressive policies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to answer this one. The short answer is yes. There was a very large concerted effort by the Hindu right to attack Mamdani, to spread misinformation, to use a lot of really disgusting, racist, and Islamophobic attacks against him. Uh, and we saw this from proxies for Cuomo. He actually specifically mentioned the Hindu community during a debate in which he's with Mamdani, where he said he used it as an example of how Mamdani was divisive. Eric Adams also worked with the Hindu right wing to attack Mamdani, and uh, there was also, recognizing this, a concerted effort by Hindu New Yorkers to organize the Hindu community for Mamdani. There was a group that formed called, I believe it was Hindus for Zaran. They organized visits to Hindu temples that Mamdani went to, where Mayor-elect Mamdani talked about his own personal background and proximity to Hinduism. His mother, Mira Nair, is Hindu, and he talked about how important it was for him to grow up learning the stories of Hinduism and really having a familiarity with the faith. Um, there was another event that the group held with Mira Nair herself, who talked about Mamdani. And I think it's actually a great example of how we can fight back against these attacks from the Hindu right. This was one where they decided to try to mobilize the Hindu community against Mamdani, mostly because of his Muslim faith, and they failed because Hindus and others rallied around him, and tried to counter this. And Safa, I don't know if you have anything to add. If you want to talk maybe about the Kajal Hindustani stuff, which I'm also happy to.
No, I think that covers most of it. Kajal Hindustani is a Hindu extremist hate speaker in India. She's actually been detained in the state of Gujarat for being so inflammatory to the point where her comments were partially responsible for sparking anti-Muslim violence, which to be detained for that in India under Narendra Modi, you can imagine how bad she must be. And she actually went on a speaking tour in the United States, where in at least one of her stops, she did fearmonger about Zohran Mamdani and talk about how he is a threat to Hindus, urging them to vote against him, and all this stuff that is very blatantly Islamophobic, but also doing a lot of reliance on this idea that Hindus and Muslims operate in direct opposition to each other, which I think that the Mamdani campaign completely blew that idea out of the water.
Thank you so much. So another couple of questions were asking if you guys could talk about the similarities between Hindutva and Zionism.
I can start with that. I just sent an article in the chat, if you guys can see that under the answered questions tab. But it is from an interview with an author named Azad Isa. He is also a journalist, and he has written a book called Hostile Homelands, talking about the deep connections between India and Israel, Hindutva and Zionism. And yeah, in a lot of ways, Hindutva is looking at Zionism as this sort of aspirational model. A lot of the tactics deployed by Zionists, both in the United States and in India, are really lauded by Hindu supremacists. You've seen in recent years Hindu supremacists in India saying that we need to carry out an Israel model in Kashmir while there's an active genocide in Gaza. That alone tells you a lot about how much admiration, or how acceptable it is to express support for these like violent exclusionary and genocidal ideologies. I think also it's important to mention that Hindu supremacists have really fallen in line behind the Zionist movement. You might have seen articles about this in Al Jazeera, where a lot of disinformation against Palestinians was actually spread by Indian right-wing accounts who would also trend hashtags like hashtag Islam is the problem when talking about anything happening in Palestine. And so there is this very interesting element that you have here where Hindu supremacists hate Muslims, which is actually Islam being a sister faith of Judaism. It's very interesting because a lot of the beliefs that Muslims hold are also held by the Jewish people. But ultimately, Hindu supremacists have thrown their full weight behind Zionists because they share this idea of a common enemy, which is the Muslim barbaric invader who is encroaching on some sacred, historically significant land. And for that reason, Hindu supremacists do take a lot of inspiration from Zionists and see this as a model that they would like to replicate. And of course, you have like other issues like India selling bombs to Israel, but you know that could be a whole other discussion. Please do check out the article. It is very informative.
That's really well said, Safa. I'll just add that we're also seeing Hindutva supporters and Zionists working together, along with Christian nationalists in the United States, to push a right-wing agenda. And there are a lot of parallels between Hindutva and Zionism. Just as it's important to understand that Hindutva is a right-wing ethno-nationalist political ideology that is distinct from Hinduism. Zionism is a right-wing ethno-nationalist ideology that is distinct from Judaism. And they certainly use common tactics of trying to conflate their political project with an entire religion and the adherents of that religion. And so you'll see a lot of similarities in the tactics that they use in trying to conflate those things, in deploying terms, saying something that is anti-Semitic if it's criticizing Israel or if it's criticizing Zionism, is the way that you're starting to see the term Hinduphobia being deployed against people who criticize Hindutva, when it's really important to hold those things as distinct. And in fact, the conflating of a political ideology with a religion, in the case of Zionism, is itself anti-Semitic, and in the case of Hindutva, is very anti-Hindu and goes against our beliefs.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions in the chat. Only about 3 minutes left officially on the panel. If you guys want to type out answers to any of these questions, you feel free, and I'll get to what I can in the order that they were presented. So another question was, given the circumstances regarding the IHRA definition and NJ bill, do you feel that Hindu nationalists will use this as a precedent to establish a similar definition equating Hinduism and Hindutva? And if so, what can be done to combat this? And maybe if you guys know what it is, can you give a background on what that bill is?
They absolutely already are. Vivek, do you want to talk about it first and then I can chime in?
Why don't you go for it? I think
Okay.
you're actually a little more familiar with this than I am.
Okay. So
So
I'm actually gonna speak in like more broad terms because I don't want to say anything wrong. I know there have been states, including Georgia, where bills defining Hindu phobia have been introduced. And if you look at who is introducing or like who is backing these bills and where the word Hindu phobia comes from, it is very much a project of the American Hindu far right. So if you look at definitions of Hindu phobia on some of these far right groups' websites, you'll see that they are not limited to hatred against Hindus, which of course is wrong and should be condemned in every instance. But they really do expand it in the same way that these definitions, like these Zionist definitions of anti-Semitism do, expanding it to cover any sort of criticism of Hinduism as a religion, and that is a direct attack on people who suffer under the caste system, which is very much alive and well, including in the United States. So you have, in addition to that, you have words that are labeled Hindu phobic, and that includes I believe, model minority, which is something that I talked about in this presentation. So to say that, you know, these groups are very much so leaning into the model minority image at the detriment of other minorities in this country, to say that to them is Hindu-phobic. So yes, there's absolutely a push to codify these types of definitions of Hindu-phobia. There is certainly an attempt to isolate progressive Hindu voices from, you know, being able to say that, hey, this shouldn't fall under the definition of Hindu-phobia. This, you know, this type of bill shouldn't be put out in my name. And of course, Vivek can talk more about that. But really, ultimately, the people who suffer because of that, because of these types of definitions, are oppressed caste Hindus. They are Muslims, Sikhs, and Indian Christians. And also academics, activists, journalists, artists, random people on social media.